You don't wake up one morning expecting your life to fall apart. But then again, who does? In my case, the first crack wasn't some dramatic confession or an accidental text. It was an expensive bottle of wine. Ironic, right? You'd think I'd notice the affair before noticing the alcohol preferences of my wife's mysterious mentor. Life, as it turns out, is an excellent prankster. Let's rewind a bit. My name's Orson. Not the kind of name you hear every day, but then again, I'm not the kind of guy you'd expect to find in this situation. I've always thought of myself as observant, detail-oriented, even the kind of person who knows exactly how their partner likes their coffee or which socks go missing in the laundry. But when it came to my wife, Melinda, it seems I missed a few crucial details. We've been married for 10 years, together for 13, and I'll admit, life had settled into its grooves. We weren't exactly the couple that finished each other's sentences anymore, but there was a comforting rhythm to our days. Or so I thought. Melinda's new job as a senior project manager at a high-end marketing firm had brought its own set of challenges. Late nights, demanding clients, and the occasional complaint about her boss, Rupert. Yes, Rupert. A name that screams middle-aged arrogance and overpriced cologne. At first, Rupert was nothing more than a name dropped in passing. He was difficult but brilliant, demanding but fair, and a game-changer in the industry. I didn't think much of it. I mean, bosses are supposed to be demanding, right? It wasn't until Melinda started mentioning him at every opportunity that the name Rupert began to feel like a pebble in my shoe. The first sign that something was off came in the form of a dinner reservation. Melinda casually mentioned that Rupert had taken the team out to celebrate a successful campaign. I nodded, half listening, until she described the restaurant, a Michelin-starred spot with a waiting list longer than my patience. I remember thinking, who takes an entire team to a place like that? But I didn't press the issue. Then there were the gifts. Melinda started coming home with little trinkets, a bottle of artisanal olive oil here, a rare book there. She claimed they were from grateful clients, but the items always seemed oddly specific, like they were chosen by someone who really knew her. Still, I let it go. The moment that truly stuck with me, though, was the wine. One Friday night, Melinda came home with a bottle of Chateau Margaux, a wine so expensive it might as well come with a deed to a vineyard. A client gave it to Rupert, she said, and he thought I'd appreciate it more. I stared at the bottle, then at her, wondering when her boss had become a sommelier with an uncanny ability to predict her taste. But the real kicker came 2 weeks later when I found an engraved pen in her work bag. It wasn't the pen itself that bothered me, but the inscription, "To M, for your brilliant mind, R." It wasn't exactly subtle. I started noticing other things after that. Melinda's work trips seemed to align perfectly with Rupert's schedule. Her wardrobe had evolved from casual chic to something that wouldn't look out of place at a gala. And the late nights at the office? They were no longer occasional. They were constant. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. I was either a paranoid husband or a fool clinging to the idea that nothing was wrong. The final straw came when Melinda's phone buzzed during dinner. She tried to play it cool, but I caught a glimpse of the message. "Let's keep Friday just between us." R. She snatched the phone away before I could read more, muttering something about work-related confidentiality. That night, as Melinda slept soundly beside me, I lay awake, my mind racing with every suspicious detail I'd ignored. The wine, the gifts, the pen, the message, it was all too much to dismiss. I decided then and there that I needed to know the truth. I wasn't sure how I'd find it, but one thing was clear. Rupert wasn't just a name anymore. He was a problem, and problems, I've learned, have a way of growing when you don't confront them. The thing about suspicions is that they're like weeds. Once they take root, they spread, choking out any hope of clarity. I'd always thought of myself as a rational guy, the kind who needed cold, hard facts before jumping to conclusions. But with every passing day, the facts were adding up faster than I could process them. And Rupert? He was starting to look less like a boss and more like a snake slithering through my marriage. After that message, my mind went into overdrive. I told myself to stay calm, to gather more evidence before confronting Melinda. If I jumped in with accusations and no proof, I'd come off as the insecure husband, paranoid and controlling. That wasn't who I wanted to be. The first thing I did was start paying attention, really paying attention. Melinda had always been good at compartmentalizing her life, but now that I was looking for signs, they were everywhere. She was on her phone constantly, and her laughter during those late-night work calls sounded different. Not the relaxed laugh she had at home, but a lighter, more deliberate one. Then there were her social media posts, or rather the lack of them. Melinda used to love sharing snippets of her day, from office selfies to her latest culinary experiments. Now, her profiles were practically barren, save for the occasional post about her amazing team. I decided to dig deeper. One evening, while Melinda was in the shower, I took a look at her laptop. We had always shared passwords, so I didn't feel like I was crossing a line, at least not at first. Her email inbox looked normal enough. Project updates, invoices, the usual work clutter. But then I noticed a folder labeled miscellaneous. Inside were emails. Hundreds of them. At first, they seemed innocent, updates on campaigns, brainstorming notes, compliments on her work. But then I noticed how many of them were from Rupert. His tone was always overly familiar, peppered with phrases like, "You're my star," and "I don't know what I'd do without you." One email even included a picture of a sunrise with the caption, "This made me think of you." I closed the laptop, my hands shaking. It wasn't enough to confront her yet, but it was enough to confirm my worst fears. Something was happening. The tipping point came when Melinda announced she'd be traveling for a weekend retreat with her team. I knew Rupert would be there. She didn't even try to hide it. I decided to track her movements. Call it a low moment, but I needed answers. I activated the location sharing feature on her phone. It was something we'd both agreed to years ago after she'd gotten lost hiking. I told myself this wasn't spying. It was self-preservation. That weekend, while Melinda was supposedly at a lakeside resort, I watched her location ping at a boutique hotel in the city, a place known for its luxurious suites and champagne brunches. My heart sank. The next day, I drove to the hotel under the guise of running errands. I didn't plan to confront her. Not yet, but I needed to see it for myself. The concierge was polite but firm when I asked for a room number. So I waited, and then I saw them. Melinda and Rupert walked out of the lobby together, laughing like old friends sharing a private joke. She was dressed in a sleek black dress I'd never seen before, and he had his hand resting on the small of her back. It hit me like a punch to the gut. Seeing them together, so casual and intimate, confirmed everything I'd tried to deny. I drove home in a daze, my mind spinning with questions. How long had this been going on? How much had she lied about? And most importantly, what was I going to do next? By the time Melinda came home that evening, all smiles and stories about team-building activities, I'd made my decision. This wasn't going to end with a quiet confrontation behind closed doors. If Rupert wanted to play the charming mentor, I was about to give him a lesson he wouldn't forget. Funny thing about betrayal, it's not just the lies, the late nights, or the whispered calls. It's the sheer creativity behind the deceit that stings the most. And let me tell you, my wife wasn't just having an affair. She was crafting a masterpiece of manipulation. A Picasso of pretense, if you will. But every great artist eventually leaves behind fingerprints. After seeing them together, I decided I needed to outsmart the situation, not just react to it. Confronting Melinda or Rupert head-on would have been predictable, even satisfying, but it wouldn't give me the kind of closure I needed. No, I wanted to understand the full scope of their betrayal before pulling the rug out from under them. I started small. I went through our shared calendar and noticed something curious. Every work trip she'd taken over the past 6 months corresponded with Rupert's social media activity. While she claimed to be at dull team-building exercises, Rupert had been posting photos of rare wines, lavish meals, and private helicopter tours. Coincidence? Maybe. But I had a growing suspicion that Melinda wasn't just attending these events. She was the reason behind them. Then came the receipts. Literally. Melinda had always been meticulous about shredding paper trails, but she'd overlooked one thing: digital receipts tied to our shared email. A confirmation for a jewelry purchase caught my attention. An engraved necklace from a boutique store downtown. The inscription? To M, the brightest star in my sky. I didn't confront her. Not yet. Instead, I kept digging, feeling more like a private investigator than a husband. That's when I discovered something that turned the whole affair on its head. Rupert wasn't just a smooth-talking executive. He was a collector of women, and he had a pattern. Using a burner email account, I reached out to a former employee at Melinda's firm who'd left suddenly a year ago. The woman, Trina, was reluctant to talk at first, but once I explained why I was asking, the floodgates opened. Rupert had pulled the same tricks on her: late-night mentorship sessions, extravagant gifts, and promises of career advancement. When she tried to end things, he threatened to ruin her reputation. She left the company quietly to avoid scandal. This revelation added a new layer to my plan. This wasn't just about me or my marriage anymore. Rupert had a system, and Melinda was the latest pawn in his twisted game. I knew I had to act, but not before delivering a blow that would hit them where it hurt the most: their image. Melinda had a milestone corporate gala coming up, one that Rupert was hosting. The event was exclusive, filled with industry leaders and press. It was supposed to be a night of celebration, of showcasing Rupert's vision and Melinda's contributions to his success. And it was the perfect stage for my next move. In the days leading up to the gala, I reached out to Trina again. With her permission, I gathered emails, photos, and even a recorded voicemail of Rupert's manipulative behavior. Then I compiled everything into a tidy little file. But I didn't stop there. I also contacted 2 more former employees who'd left under suspicious circumstances. Their stories matched Trina's almost perfectly. By the end of the week, I had a dossier thick enough to sink Rupert's reputation faster than the Titanic. The final touch was setting up a special delivery for the gala night. I contacted a tech-savvy friend who helped me create a fake corporate website that mirrored Rupert's firm's official page. Only this version included a section titled "A Culture of Abuse: The Rupert Files." The dossier was uploaded there, along with an option to anonymously report further misconduct. On the day of the gala, I played my part perfectly. I dressed in my best suit, smiled for the cameras, and even complimented Melinda on her stunning dress. She looked radiant, glowing with the excitement of being Rupert's shining star. If she noticed the tension in my jaw, she didn't say a word. The climax was perfectly orchestrated. As Rupert took the stage to deliver his keynote speech, I slipped away to a discreet corner of the ballroom and sent out the link to the Rupert files to every guest in attendance. Executives, journalists, and even his own board members received the email with a subject line that read, "What your VP doesn't want you to know." The reactions were immediate. Phones buzzed, whispers spread, and Rupert's polished demeanor began to crack as he noticed the ripple of unease sweeping through the crowd. And Melinda? She didn't notice a thing until someone tapped her on the shoulder and showed her the website. The thing about pulling the rug out from under someone is that you don't just want them to fall. You want them to hang in the air for a moment, realizing what's happening before gravity takes them. That's what the gala was for Rupert. He didn't just trip. He tumbled into a pit he'd been digging for years, while the crowd politely applauded his demise. And me? I stood there, invisible, watching my wife's smile slowly curdle into confusion, then dread. The first sign of chaos came from the VIP section. A man in a tailored suit leaned over to show his phone to the woman next to him, who gasped audibly. Then, one by one, heads began to bow as people checked their devices. The energy in the room shifted, subtle at first, like the crack of a fault line before an earthquake. Rupert, ever the performer, pushed through. His voice was smooth, his hand gestures precise, but beads of sweat began forming on his temple. He couldn't ignore the murmurs, the way the once attentive audience had dissolved into a sea of distracted whispers. It was Melinda's reaction, though, that fascinated me most. She wasn't looking at Rupert anymore. Her eyes darted around the room, scanning faces, her confident posture slowly crumbling. I could almost see the gears turning in her head. What's happening? Why is everyone on their phones? That's when her assistant, a young woman who had been glued to Melinda's side all evening, tapped her shoulder and showed her something on her own phone. I didn't need to see the screen to know it was the Rupert files. Her face froze. I watched from a corner, sipping my drink as she tried to maintain composure. She leaned in close to the assistant, whispering furiously. The assistant hesitated, then handed Melinda the phone. I'll never forget the way her lips moved as she read the headline, her expression a mix of disbelief and panic. Then, like a moth to a flame, Her gaze lifted, scanning the room until she found me. For a moment, we just stared at each other. It was like watching a tower collapse in slow motion. Her confident, polished demeanor melted away, replaced by something raw and unfamiliar. And me? I just smiled. Not a big, triumphant grin, just enough to let her know I wasn't a fool anymore. By now, Rupert's speech had completely unraveled. Someone near the stage stood up and walked out, followed by another, and then another. Rupert faltered, his words stumbling as his carefully curated persona cracked wide open. He tried to make a joke about technical difficulties, but nobody laughed. It was then that the final nail in his coffin arrived. A woman in her late 30s, dressed in a sleek black dress, marched toward the stage. It was Trina. I hadn't expected her to show up, but there she was, holding her phone high as if it were a torch. "Rupert," she said, her voice cutting through the murmurs like a blade. "You want to talk about leadership? Why don't we talk about this instead?" She gestured to the screen, and someone in the crowd connected their phone to the projector. The Rupert Files website appeared in vivid detail on the massive screen behind him. Gasps rippled through the audience as the room filled with the sound of clicking cameras. Rupert's face turned ashen. He mumbled something into the microphone, but it was drowned out by the growing noise. And Melinda? She wasn't looking at Rupert anymore. She was looking at me, her expression a mix of fury and fear. She took a step toward me, but I raised my glass in a silent toast and walked away, leaving her to face the fallout. I didn't go home that night. Instead, I booked myself a room at a modest but comfortable hotel, where I spent the evening scrolling through social media as the story of Rupert's fall spread like wildfire. The website was trending, the video of Trina's confrontation was being shared by journalists, and Rupert's career was effectively over. But what intrigued me most were the comments. Former employees, industry insiders, even competitors chimed in, each adding their own piece to the puzzle. Rupert's empire wasn't just crumbling, it was imploding. As for Melinda, I didn't hear from her that night. I assumed she was busy dealing with the wreckage of her reputation, her carefully constructed image of loyalty and professionalism now in tatters. And me? I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not happiness exactly. Not yet. But freedom. There's a strange calm that settles over you when the dust begins to clear. It's not relief, not exactly, but something sharper. Like a deep breath taken just before you dive into the icy unknown. For me, that calm came the morning after the gala, sitting in a hotel room that smelled faintly of cheap coffee and fresh paper. The fallout had begun, and for once, I wasn't the one bracing for impact. I woke to over 40 unread messages on my phone. Not from Melinda. She hadn't dared to call me yet, but from colleagues, mutual friends, and a few nosy acquaintances who couldn't resist poking at the drama. The headlines were already everywhere. Corporate VP's scandalous fall from grace. Exposé rocks marketing firm gala. Whistleblower destroys powerful exec's career. Rupert was done. The website I'd built with Trina's help had taken on a life of its own. Anonymous reports flooded in overnight, detailing a pattern of manipulation, harassment, and abuses of power that spanned years. The company had no choice but to suspend him pending an internal investigation. A spokesperson had issued a vague statement about taking the allegations seriously, but the damage was irreversible. And Melinda? She was caught in the undertow. Her association with Rupert was no secret, and while the full extent of their relationship hadn't been confirmed publicly, the whispers had already started. She'd built her career on connections, on being seen as indispensable. Now, that same visibility was working against her. I didn't have to wait long for her to reach out. Around 9 a.m., my phone buzzed with a single message. "We need to talk." I let it sit there for an hour before replying. Not because I needed time to think, but because I wanted her to stew in the silence. Finally, I sent back, "Meet me at the house at 3. Alone. When I arrived, Melinda was already there, sitting on the couch with her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She looked exhausted, her usual composure replaced with an anxious restlessness I'd never seen before. I didn't sit down. Instead, I stood in the doorway, keeping my distance. She started to speak, but I held up a hand to stop her. I wasn't interested in her excuses, her justifications. or her carefully rehearsed apologies. Instead, I laid it all out. I told her I knew everything: the gifts, the late-night calls, the trips, the necklace. I told her about Trina, about the others, about the website and the gala. Her face went pale as I spoke, and for once, she didn't interrupt. When I finished, I reached into my bag and pulled out a folder. Inside were copies of everything: emails, receipts, and messages that painted a clear picture of her betrayal. I placed it on the coffee table and told her to read it later. She finally broke her silence, her voice trembling as she asked me what I wanted. It was a fair question. After all, I'd already dismantled her professional life. But this wasn't just about revenge. It was about closure. I told her I wanted a clean break. No drawn-out fights, no back-and-forths over who was to blame. I'd already contacted a lawyer and started the divorce process. All I needed from her was cooperation. Her expression crumbled as she realized how serious I was. She tried to argue, to plead, but I shut it down. This isn't salvageable, I told her. And you know it. For the first time, I saw her for what she really was. Not the confident, ambitious woman I'd married, but someone who had built her life on appearances and half-truths. Without them, she had nothing. I left the house without looking back, my decision final. Whatever came next, it would be mine to build, free from her lies and Rupert's shadow. As I drove away, the calm settled over me again. Not the sharp edge of vengeance this time, but something softer, something closer to peace. Closure is a strange thing. People think it's an answer, a neatly tied bow on a tangled mess. But the truth is, closure isn't an ending. It's a decision. It's deciding you're done waiting for justice, for apologies, for the universe to make sense. That's what I realized as I stood in my new apartment, surrounded by boxes and a future I didn't recognize yet. I wasn't looking for closure anymore. I was building it. The divorce was finalized in record time. Melinda didn't put up much of a fight. I think she knew there was no point. Her professional life was in shambles, and her personal life wasn't far behind. Rupert, unsurprisingly, vanished as soon as the scandal hit its peak. Last I heard, he'd fled to Europe under the guise of pursuing new opportunities. The irony? He left Melinda to deal with the wreckage he'd helped create. I'd expected to feel triumphant when the papers were signed, but instead, I just felt free. Not the kind of freedom that comes with celebration, but the quiet kind. The kind where you realize the weight you've been carrying is finally gone. But life wasn't done with its little surprises. A month after the dust settled, I got an email from Trina. She wanted to thank me again for what I'd done, not just for her, but for everyone Rupert had hurt. Her message was warm, sincere, and ended with an unexpected offer. If you're ever in the mood for coffee and conversation, let me know. You got a knack for shaking up the status quo, and I could use more people like that in my life. I hesitated. The idea of diving into anything new felt foreign, almost reckless. But then I remembered the calm I'd found, the realization that I didn't need to keep carrying the past. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to let someone else in. We met at a small cafe downtown. Trina was everything I'd admired from our earlier interactions. Sharp, funny, and unapologetically honest. The conversation flowed easily, and for the first time in months, I felt something spark. Not a flame, not yet, but the warmth of possibility. As I walked back to my car that evening, I found myself smiling. Not because of Trina, though I couldn't deny she intrigued me, but because I realized something important. I'd survived. Rupert's empire was gone. Melinda's mask had cracked. And me? I was still standing, a little battered, maybe, but stronger for it. Life doesn't hand you clean endings or perfect victories. It's messy, chaotic, and often unfair. But if you're lucky, if you're really lucky, it hands you a chance to start over. And that, I decided, was enough. The next morning, as the sun rose over the city, I opened my laptop and deleted the folder labeled Rupert and Melinda. I didn't need it anymore. Somewhere out there, they were both dealing with the fallout of their choices. And me? I had a coffee date to plan. Funny how the worst moments of your life can lead to the best decisions you've ever made.